Good morning, Manya, and welcome to Conflict Managed.
Hi, Mary. It's a pleasure to be talking to you today.
I'm so delighted to chat with you. Very rarely do I get to talk with other podcast hosts, and of course, people working in this space to bringing about healing and peace in the world. So, before we get into the work that you're currently doing, can you tell us about the first job you ever had as a young person?
I had some paid jobs with my father. He paid me to do some work on some construction sites, and that was fun. But I count my first paid job as a clerk in a bookstore. And I loved it. I'm very bookish. I love books. I ended up working in fields that were related to books. And I I loved working with people who would come and say, "Can you recommend a book?" And then even just opening up the boxes of the new books that arrived and, getting to touch them and put them on the shelves. And I just loved that experience.
What a wonderful first job, because when you talk to some people, that's their dream job, either working at a bookstore or opening a bookstore, a little boutique, and maybe having some cats around or something else in a picturesque place. It just sounds like um, a wonderful, a wonderful kind of job for the reasons that you mentioned. What was the management like there?
You know, Pretty lax, pretty hands off. This was either my senior year of high school or my first year of college. So, an older teen. And I think my manager was maybe 2 or 3 years older than me.
Mhm.
And, you know, in fact, I would say that the management was lax enough that I never really thought about it as management. He was the guy who had to sign the timesheet, and he was the one who handed me the check. But other than that, it didn't feel like there was much difference between us.
That also sounds like a fairly nice place to work in the
Yes.
sense of, if insofar as you can show up and do your job in a job like that, the manager just really needs to make sure everything is flowing
Yes.
and not
Yes.
so much of what in a lot of other jobs we need managers to, lead us and develop us in a variety of ways.
Yes. I felt like the major differences between us, one was he had the key. He was the one who opened and locked the doors when we needed to, and he handled the money. But all the rest of it felt like we just were colleagues.
Mm. That is a nice feeling at work. So where did you go from there?
Where did I go from there? A bunch of odd jobs during school, during college, and after college, also some odd jobs, and then graduate school, where I studied to be a librarian. I studied research, and that came about because I didn't know what to do. I couldn't figure out what I wanted to do for a living after college. And I started looking at catalogs for graduate school. This was back in the day where you could go to the library and there were shelves and shelves of these paper things you could just sit and look through. And I found the program for library and information science, and every class, "Oh gosh, I want to take this. Oh, I can't wait to learn this." I thought, okay, this is telling me something. And went through the program at Simmons College in Boston and have been gainfully employed ever since.
So what kind of a librarian are you?
I focused on special libraries, which is the term that means essentially anything that's not a public library or a school library or a university library.
Hmm.
So special libraries are in companies have them. That's where I ended up working. I also worked at a university, but not at their academic library. I worked in the library of an administrative department.
And
And I loved that because I think in college I felt that I was wanting to be in a corporate environment. There's something about that. I didn't know much about it, didn't have much experience, didn't have many family in that milieu. it just felt like that's what I wanted to do. So when I got into library science and realized I could still pursue a corporate career path, it just seemed to me the perfect meeting of the two things that I loved most, kind of books and research, and then this corporate world that I didn't really know what it was going to be like, but I thought I would like it.
So you wanted to be in a corporate environment, not knowing much about it. So what was the reality, or what has reality been versus what you thought it was going to be like?
I think the reality was that it was a lot of what I was looking for. I think one of the things I wanted from it was that structure,
Mm-hmm.
the 9 to 5, 9-ish to 5-ish
Mm-hmm.
structure. And also early on in my career, I did appreciate the management structure, the somebody saying, this is what your responsibility is, and this is when I'm expecting you to do it. So kind of that external motivation to do the work. And that was helpful for me, honestly, to learn to do all of those things on my own. But it's helpful to be in an environment where I could do that, where somebody was helping me with it. And then I was able to build that motivation on my own.
That's such an interesting answer. It really resonates with me in the sense that I love a structure. I love a good structure, and I also really like being creative, but I
Mhm.
find creativity happens for me within a given structure.
Yes.
No.
Yes. In fact, now I've had many career roles, but one of the things that's been true for me is I do a lot of writing. And the best way for me to do writing is to start with an outline, to give myself that structure. And I think that's one of the things I also learned in the corporate environment, that I have this creative side, but it comes out best when it's coupled with that structure.
Yeah, it's interesting to me because it seems like those don't tend to, you would think they maybe don't work together. You want to be creative, so you think outside of the box. Or even when we think about good management, we are, wary of micromanagement. And so some people show up and they're going to be the good manager. They're not going to micromanage. And it's like, where are they? Right? There's
Yes.
no structure. And so finding that sweet spot, but it also depends, of course, on where you are in your career trajectory as to once you learn the parameters, especially in any given organization, then you're working within that structure. And so there are
Yes.
different levels of which a great manager can really help you grow and develop.
Yes. I've had a few manager roles in my career, and I am very much a hands-off manager. I want to say, here's what I need you to do. Go, just do it. And come to me if you have any questions, but otherwise just kind of let you on your own. And so for me, it's always a learning experience to realize that's not how everybody works best.
Mhm.
And that I need to work with somebody that I'm working with to understand a little more about their style. And do I need to be a little more hands-on? Because I tend to want to let people just run on their own. And there have been times that wasn't the way to go.
So tell me a little bit about how your management style has developed. So you've told me about, about learning more about the people that report to you so that you can really help them achieve what it is you want them to achieve. So can you tell us a little bit about maybe like your first management role versus the last one you've had, and how you have developed?
Gosh, my first management role, I managed a lot of work study students. And there were, what was helpful was there were very specific parameters for the kinds of work they could do, when they could and couldn't come in to do the work. And so in some ways that actually felt easy because I was also being given some instruction on what to do. And I haven't had a ton of management roles. And in fact, I moved myself out of the corporate world into a place where not only am I not managing people, I don't have a manager. So I'm trying to think. The latest project where had, I effectively was a manager, I really spent a lot of time recognizing what the other person needed, what
Mm.
worked for them. And I would say something or ask them to do something and then realize I didn't give enough instruction. And then, and through our working together, I was able to figure out what the best way for us to work together was in when I was kind of giving those instructions or being in the manager role.
Mhm.
And I liked that feeling of that I was able to recognize this individual's strengths and the things they weren't so good at, and how could we work together to achieve our goal.
I love that because it's all curiosity, right? For the person who wants, is the micromanager who just is very concerned and wants to manage. I mean, the antidote is stepping back and being curious. And for someone like maybe with your temperament who just, hey, we're all professionals, let's just get it done,
Yes.
right? While that is still true, people, as you have already said, work in a variety of ways. So again, that curiosity of, okay, well, how can I maximize this person's strengths and we do have weaknesses. And so how can we make sure that the whatever we're working on is this collaborative, but we
Yes.
collaborate when we listen to the other and we really see the other person.
Yes. And when I realized, I kind of stepped out of myself and realized, oh, that's what I'm doing. I thought, oh, golly, I've learned a lot. I actually understand a little bit how to work with people now.
It's wonderful, and I feel like it's humbling to look at our own story, our own arc of development. And when I think about the missteps I had, and if any of my former colleagues listen to this show, they can say, "Well, Mary, I don't know why you're talking about conflict. You ran like a little lost kid, when a conflict came around," and I did. But to look at how we do grow and develop and to celebrate that, I think. And also to them to remember that everybody else, they're on a journey and they're not done either.
Right. And we're not in the same place, and we might not know where they are in their journey. That has been something that I've had to learn, that accepting people where they are.
So tell us a little bit about that, certainly in relationship to what you're doing now as a career. And can you maybe tell us how you got there?
So, what I'm doing now as a career is I'm working as a consultant and a speaker, and I work with organizations to build compassionate leadership and to really change the culture to be one of compassion and support. And I imagine listeners are thinking, well, that's very far from studying library science. And you are not wrong if that is what you are thinking. I worked for many years in library science and in publishing, and then on my own in marketing as an independent contractor working in marketing. And the change came a little bit more than 11 years now. I was at the finish line of the Boston Marathon in 2013 when two bombs exploded. And that really changed the trajectory of my life in many ways. But in terms of the career path, what happened was I started to realize that there wasn't a lot of conversation about the mental and emotional wounds after. And that was my experience. Thankfully, I was not physically injured. And the response and the press focused on the catastrophic physical injuries and the individuals who had died and didn't quite expand out much further to include those of us who had mental health wounds. And I felt invisible. After the worst thing that ever happened to me, I felt like people were telling me my experience didn't count, and myself and people like me had to fight for services. And I know I met people many years later who never even found some of the services that I found because they didn't ask the right question or talk to the right person at a random time. And I started to see the world through the lens of how are we helping people who are traumatized? Because mass violence is one kind of trauma that people experience. Natural disasters are one that, as we're recording this, we know that there are many people who are dealing with Hurricane Helene, and that is also a trauma that these individuals are experiencing. And many other, car accidents, personal violence, domestic violence, all of these things really challenge a person, and we go into our fight or flight mode, and it changes how we respond to the world. Sometimes for a long time. Some people get over it quickly, others it takes longer. And we are walking through a world that doesn't recognize that very easily. And as I started thinking about this and advocating in this direction, it started to merge with my other life of thinking about how do we communicate, and thinking about the corporate world, which I don't work in, but I know and love. And I started to look at how are companies helping people who've been traumatized. Because if you've got, more than a handful of people in your company, somebody in that organization has dealt with a trauma at some point in their life. Might not be something they're actively even thinking about, but there are enough of us out there. So that's how I came about wanting to work with organizations to become more trauma informed. And I'm going to be honest with you, I don't always say the word trauma when I talk about this work, because nobody likes to think about trauma. Nobody wants to think that they might be traumatized. It's difficult to think about how can I help someone who is traumatized. So that's one of the reasons I kind of went up another level and said, well, we're talking about compassion in the organization. And the principles of a trauma-informed organization, if you look at all of them, they just bubble up to, am I acting compassionately towards the people in my workplace?
I'm so sorry that you went through that experience.
Thank
And when we think about trauma, right, when we show up to work, we show up with just humanity, ourselves. On any given day, it could be, we had the best night's sleep of our life,
you.
and the
Yes.
person next to us could have just found out that their partner has a cancer diagnosis, and two people down, their child might have died a couple of years ago, and military people, and there's so many. The human experience is messy and it's
Yes.
wonderful. And for some of us, we experience trauma. And as I love that you pointed out, people deal with trauma in different ways. There's not like you get a formula. This happens, so you get this much time to get over it, right?
Yes.
And so there's nothing wrong with someone who processes it in 6 months and somebody who processes it in 10 years. It's very specific. And so I love this idea of how can we be compassionate? And I like thinking about a human-centric work environment, which I think has to do with compassion, right?
Absolutely. I find this interesting. I feel like every person I have ever met in my life has some amount of compassion for someone in their life, right? We all have different levels of it. Some of us are oozing compassion, others of us, you have to kind of chip away to find it. But everybody I know has compassion for somebody in their life. And it's interesting to me that that is true, and we haven't found a way to consistently translate that to an organization that is, after all, made up of individual people who have compassion.
Yeah.
And I don't know entirely what that barrier is between our individual compassion and then creating organizations that are compassionate.
I wonder if this is what I think about that sometimes. Though there are these, I taught ethics for a long time, and ethics of care says that there are these different ways of kind of approaching the moral life. And one is ethics of justice, and one is the ethics of care. And the ethics of justice, it is represented by there are these rules, and in order to get along, we need people to follow these kinds of rules. And if you don't, then there are these issues. The ethics of care says, well, there's more to life than these rules. It's we are who we are and what we can accomplish by the quality of our relationships. We are enmeshed in these relationships. So it's not these um, these detached rules that govern
Hmm.
everything, but it's the quality of our relationships, and therefore people are varied. And so I think there are these warring ways of thinking. And I think a lot of business is this ethics of justice, or in order to move forward, we have to have these detached rules that apply to everyone.
Hmm.
And I think it's both. I don't think it's one or the other. So I guess it's a
Yes.
question of how do you marry it? So if you think about someone listening to this and they say, compassion is all well and good, but I need my people to show up at 8 a.m.
Yes.
So,
I had a very interesting conversation in one of my workshops with a manager who was dealing with someone who needed time off for a trauma that they had experienced. And the manager was having a hard time telling the person that they needed to come back to work because the manager didn't want to seem insensitive to what was going on with the employee, and in fact was not at all insensitive, cared very much about what was happening to this person, but also as a manager needed to be accomplishing this task at work that this person needed to help them with, and was having a really hard time because the manager didn't want to say, you need to come back, or you need to, or we need to talk about when are you going to come back. Like, they couldn't even have that conversation. And in the workshop, we talked about the importance of setting boundaries because I, I guess I only speak for myself, but I think this works for other humans as well. When we have boundaries, it's quite helpful to understand what are the limits of what I can and can't do. And for me anyway, that helps me. I guess it's a sort of structure that I appreciate. And so we were talking about setting boundaries and communicating boundaries is compassion.
mhm.
Otherwise, you're setting yourself up for disappointment and difficulties, and you're setting them up for disappointment and difficulties. And another participant shared a similar experience where they had a chance to sit down with a person and say, let's talk about this. You know, we appreciate you, we want to continue working with you. You know, your job is here, how can we be of assistance? Let's talk about some rules we can set for this time off that you're getting. And so it was quite eye-opening to me, and I really appreciated the conversation about boundaries
Mm.
and how those are compassionate. So that is not an exact answer to your question, but that's what I think of when I think about it's difficult to have difficult conversations, all of us, even somebody who talks about helping people go through difficult conversations. It's still hard for me to have these conversations. And I think it's very much about communication and boundaries. And the other thing is just starting small. So if you feel like we need more compassion in this organization, it's not, let's create this whole program. It's, what's one thing I can do today to show more compassion? What's one thing we can think about on a policy level or a system level that would be easy to implement, that would be more compassionate? You know, what's one thing we can do that would move the culture in that direction of being more compassionate? I think often we think of we have to go from 0 to 100 immediately. But, you know, as someone who is now goes through the world and can tell who's compassionate and who's not, any movement along that line towards the goal of being compassionate is beneficial. And people see it. You know, as someone who is traumatized, I was still working. I saw when people made what were relatively small concessions to them, but were huge to me. And I knew they were trying. And it didn't matter that it wasn't perfect. I knew they were trying.
It's just all brilliant. Everything that you said, I absolutely agree with. Because I mean, I am a kind of person who I want to put a plan together. I want to have, ABC, write it all out, have this structure. And this is because I'm a fixer. I want to fix it. And this is what we need to do. And who gets on board? Well, I lose the list, right? And so the real answer is, how do you start with change? You just do it. And you talk and what can I do today in this circumstance for this person, right? How do I,
Yes.
and the more we do it, the more we do it. This is the way it works, right? The more I do it, the
Yes.
more I think about it. Therefore, the more I see where I didn't see before. And there's most of us, the vast, vast majority love helping our neighbor, love helping our
Yes.
colleague. And if I
Yes.
see I do this little thing and this person gets so much out of it, it's very reinforcing
Yes.
to continue that
Absolutely.
behavior. Yeah.
And one of the things we talked about before is difficult conversations.
Mhm.
So if you're talking to someone in your organization who's been traumatized about their experience, or you're having to kind of dig deep into that, it is a difficult conversation.
Mhm.
It's uncomfortable. We don't like to, first of all, we don't like to be, most of us don't like to be nosy, and we kind
Right.
of want to let people have their own, share what you need to share. It's also very difficult to hear something awful that happened to someone else, because if we care about the person, it's difficult because we know they're in pain. But
Mhm.
also, if we're empathetic, we can feel that pain. And it also can cause fear that this random thing that happened to you that's horrible could happen to me.
Mhm.
And I don't want to think about that. I don't want to think that I or my family could be in danger from this awful thing that happened to you too. So there's all these things that we're not necessarily thinking of, but that are happening as we're listening in these conversations. And something you talked about earlier was coming at these conversations with a sense of curiosity. And that is what has helped me as I have difficult conversations, is putting on that hat of, I don't want to get caught up in the emotions of this. I will, but I want to recognize my own emotions. And I just want to be curious about their experience. And so when we're talking about this small incremental change, like you were saying, a coworker who can see a difference, if you just come to me with that curiosity of, share your story if you want, don't share your story, but how can I be of assistance? Or what is most helpful to you? Coming at it with that sense of curiosity, not the sense of, I know how to fix it, I've been through this before, I know X, etc. I mean, and I'm guilty of the, oh, I've been through a trauma, I can help you. I know this because this is what I went through. I mean, I've done it, and I know what it's like on the receiving end, and I've done it. So just coming in with curiosity, how are you feeling? What are you thinking about? That is the easiest start to making that incremental change. Oh, let me be clear. I also really like a program. And I really like, here's all the new policies we have to enact. And as a consultant, I can certainly bring those,
Mhm.
but that's cannot be what to lead with.
Yeah. Oh, I so agree. And it just seemed counterintuitive, like, okay, we're gonna put this program in place and then we're gonna get up to speed. But really, if you want buy-in, it has to be on
Yes.
the ground up. And so when people do something that's very manageable and it doesn't feel like a new program that
Yes.
is now implemented that will be forgotten and there'll be a new program. If people really see, oh, this little thing I can do and I see the change, and then maybe 6 months, a year go by and another little thing, and then from the groundswell, well, what can we do in the future? So when this, if this kind of thing happens again, that we can support. And so it's becomes organic,
Hmm.
organic, but intentional, right? So
Yes.
there's somebody leading the charge and moving us in
Yes.
the right direction.
Yes. Yes, absolutely intentional. And I think about having that compassionate culture champion in the organization who is thinking about things through this lens. And as you say, not necessarily top down policy, we need to do ABC. That might be part of it, but is really helping people understand how to just make those small changes and is keeping an eye on things, make sure we're still moving in the right direction. Changing the culture, changing behavior is difficult. At the best of times, even when somebody believes that the change is good and important, it's still hard to make change.
That is so true. I also was thinking about, the manager. So we have somebody who maybe needs to be on leave because of a trauma they have experienced. And let's suppose this manager has 10 other people on the team. And so she has a variety of things to consider. When this person is gone, who's going to be doing that work? What is the impact going to be on everybody? And trying to manage all of those things because parity and fairness and justice in the an environment is very important, right? That
Mhm.
doesn't mean we're all treated the same
Right.
because we have different considerations and we have different needs. But, when we think about, okay, let's suppose this person needs time off, partnering with them, what do you think is reasonable at this
Yes.
time? How do
Yes.
you imagine the team moving forward? And so bringing them into that conversation, because a lot of times, of course, especially if something is going on right at this moment, we're shut down and we're only thinking about ourselves
Yes.
mostly and surviving, which is reasonable. But to help that person, ask them for their input, ask them to join the wider conversation so that they're not shut out,
Yes.
but then also that can help them think, okay, this manager is partnering with me, but there is also the work that needs to get done.
Yes. And what you said is, it gets at something very important. So, someone, if you're specifically thinking about someone who's experienced a trauma, one of the things a trauma does is take away a person's sense of control. And many people who experience trauma experience something similar to what I did, which is that your trauma is not visible, or people expect that you should just be able to brush it off because it's not as severe as something else that happened to somebody in a similar experience. And the kind of conversation you're talking about, partnering with somebody, is giving them control, is helping them see that they still have control over what's happening to them in the work environment. We're not just going to say to you, this is what is happening to you. And meeting you where you are. So in the initial aftermath of a trauma, we're not going to have that conversation because you just need to take time off. But eventually we're going to start having those conversations and give you that control. And it also shows that you recognize their experience
Mm.
and that you're validating that what they experienced was real. And that is something that I know a lot of trauma survivors didn't get after the thing that happened to them. They didn't get that validation. And the kind of interaction you just described gives them that validation and shows them that they have some control over what's happening in their job and their career.
So I suppose I'm just a colleague, so I'm not the manager, and maybe I'm not involved in those kinds of conversations. And I just maybe know that there was a car accident or something happened. I don't really know the specifics. And I don't want to be nosy, right? So I
Yeah.
don't want to be intrusive and say, well, what happened to you? Or how are you feeling? Well, maybe what happened to you, or maybe in that direct kind of way. Do you have any advice about how to partner, to be a good colleague, to be compassionate when you think there's something going on, but you don't really know?
Just be open about what you're thinking. Hey, Mary, I feel like there might be something going on with you. I don't know what it is and you don't have to share with me, but I'm here if you need me. That simple. It doesn't have to be complicated. And you can say that multiple times. One thing especially when you're going through a trauma, it's very hard to intake information. It's very hard to remember. Even information you're looking for and you're desperate for, still, the emotion makes it difficult to hear it. So they come into work the next day, say that, oh, I heard a rumor that something happened to you. I'm so sorry. I'm here if you want to talk about it. Next week, how you doing? You know, you don't have to share details if you don't want, but just know that I'm here and I can help with X project if you need that, if you're struggling with that. Just the simple things make a real big difference. We do get afraid to talk to somebody after something bad has happened. If you've had a loved one die, you know that it doesn't take very long and people will stop asking you about your person and they'll stop saying their name. And I have absolutely done this where it feels like, oh, if I say something, it's going to make them remember or it's going to get them upset. Same thing is true with trauma survivors. If we're upset, we're already upset. And if we're not upset and you say something and it gets us upset, that's okay. You know, but just being seen and offering just simple kindness. It can feel really hard in the moment. I mean, I say that like I do it right every single time. It's still difficult, even for me, knowing how important this kind of conversation is. It can still be hard for me to say that because I also feel, oh, I don't want to be nosy. I don't want to make them talk about it if they don't want to talk about it. But guess what? If they don't want to talk about it, they won't.
Right.
Like you're not going to make them talk about it.
That's a really good point. And this idea of invisible, right? So we don't see people's emotional scars. Every once in a while, we see them bubbling up into certain kinds of behaviors,
Yes.
but mostly we don't see that. And I think it's interesting because we trick ourselves when we see an external sign that something has gone wrong. So somebody is using crutches or they're in a wheelchair or they're limping or they have, a cane or something, and that can trick us into thinking we know they need our help and that may not be true at all. The principle still stands. Ask, be curious.
Yes. Yes. The number of people I know in wheelchairs who say that people will just come and start pushing them because they think they need help when that is an assault on that person. I mean, that's an extreme example of somebody seeing somebody and just assuming they need help without having that conversation. And yeah, I think, I don't know, we get afraid to ask. I
Yeah.
think and especially in a work environment,
Mm.
especially these days, we're still very much supposed to be in work mode. And I think that's changed a little bit because of the pandemic. We've a little bit started to recognize that people's full lives, they bring their full lives to work.
Mhm.
We still have that. We need to have a professional conversation. Well, certainly if you're in a pitch meeting with clients, that probably isn't the time. But certainly in the hallway, at your desk, on a Zoom call where you're just bringing each other up to date with your projects, it's not inappropriate to check in with somebody how they're doing. In fact, I encourage that.
Yeah. That's such a good point. We don't want to be intrusive. We want to be professional. Okay, so let's talk about what does it to me? What does it mean to be
Yeah.
professional? What does it mean to be a good colleague? And I've been thinking a lot about what are good words for an excellent work environment. And it's a community. It's a community of a certain
Yes.
kind, right?
Hmm.
And so in order to be a member of good standing, in a community, then we do look outside of ourselves. And if we see somebody that we think might be in trouble, doesn't mean they are, and it doesn't mean they aren't. And so
Right.
thinking about even forming our professional self before we're in that circumstance, what could we do? What could we say?
Hmm.
What resonates with us so it doesn't feel intrusive, but it demonstrates that we see them.
Yes. And I so appreciate you using the word community. I have come to that point as well, thinking the workplace is a community. We've come together for a shared purpose. Maybe that's to make widgets or whatever it is we're supposed to be doing, but you've come together for this shared purpose. So you have that in common, if nothing else. And you mentioned, what does it mean to be a professional? And I think that what we've learned about being a professional has come from, the corporate world of 50 years ago, where people stayed in the same workplace for 50 years and got a gold watch when they retired. It was very structured. There were policies and procedures, and you didn't talk about your personal life, and maybe the guys went out after work for smoking and drinking, and that's where you talked about stuff. But like, work was work. And I think that we still have that concept that that's what professional means, that you are in this mode where you don't think about what it means to be a human, and we don't let each other bring our full human selves to the table. And that's detrimental whether you've experienced a trauma or not.
Mhm.
That's just not accepting of the way that we live our lives.
Mhm. And certainly not in the modern era. I mean,
No.
but I suppose people say, well, it worked just fine. Well, it worked, quote unquote, worked for a time in history, but we're not doing business like we did 200 years ago. So
Yes.
let's live in 2024, accept reality. And reality is that the workplace is diverse. And
Yes.
and therefore there are a variety of different, it's not just dominated by one type of one kind of person. So we want something else. People are demanding something else. And actually, for the bottom line, uh,
Yes.
it's it's actually beneficial to treat your people well.
Yes. One small silver lining to the pandemic was our acceptance of people's lives beyond their work personas. If you think about those early Zoom calls where, and still, where people, their child would come in and they would just set their child on their lap and continue to have the conversation, or the cat would walk across the screen, or you'd hear the dog barking. Previous to the pandemic, don't ever, like, we can't hear that you have a child, we don't want to hear the dog, that's disrupting the meeting. And it got to the point, I remember early on, where people started posting pictures of their cat sitting on their laptop, and my colleague is not letting me work. And I love that it enabled us to recognize the full people that we are, that when we come to work, we still have children, we still have pets, we still have traumas, we still have all these things going on. And it was okay to have that in this work environment, because it was this quasi personal, quasi work environment. So I think that recognition was a huge, good result from the pandemic, which does not have very many good results from it.
Yeah, it certainly, in the world of work was changing, and that it just really pushed the change. And
Yes.
we're still dealing with it, and we'll still be dealing with what does this new life mean in the work environment when it comes to hybrid, remote, in person, all these kinds of questions that it
Yes.
just will continue to be working through.
Yes. I follow a lot of disability activists on social media. And early in the pandemic, there was a lot of anger of, I have been asking for accommodations for years. I have been asking to work from home for years, and my company said it's not possible. And yet within 2 weeks, our entire organization was virtual. And I really that really hit home to how there are whole categories of people that our current world of work is not serving,
Yeah.
and that we can do it differently. And I hope we don't backslide from a lot of the advancements that were made to accepting different ways of working.
Yeah, I agree, right? It was very interesting. I was thinking this exact same thing about, you know, what's possible. What's possible is, well, what do you want to make possible? What do you value?
Mm-hmm.
And the more we think about that, so a while ago in our conversation, I said, okay, we've got these two ways of thinking. We've got the ethics of justice and the ethics of care. How do we marry those together at work? And you said pretty much conversation, right? We have these structures, and yet we have a personal side where a personalist account of compassion. How do we still get the business of work done, but that curiosity and that conversation with the individual? And I mean, that is the answer. What else is there? We have, there are certain things that need to be done, and they're all different kinds of jobs, right? So the
Yes.
accommodations that we can make, what's reasonable in one organization, the one kind of work may just be out of the question because they're
Right.
a lifeguard or whatever it might be, right?
Right.
But having those kinds of conversations where where we if we're the manager or the colleague and we're reticent because we don't want to get it wrong and we don't want to X, Y, or Z, being upfront about that and not pushing the other person to reveal, but
Yes.
asking the other person to partner. What do you need? How can we move forward in this work?
Yes. And you said something really important, the fear of getting it wrong. So let me completely erase that fear for your listeners. You will. You will say the wrong thing with the best of intentions, and it's okay if you own up to it. Just, oh, that came out wrong. That's not what I meant. Or it might not have to be that direct. But I think one of the reasons we don't say things sometimes is because we're afraid of getting it wrong. But we are going to get it wrong. So just be ready. If you get it wrong, own it and move on.
That's such excellent advice because I think in general, our culture is adverse to mistakes. If we make a
Yes.
mistake, we'll be called out, we'll be branded, we might be canceled or demoted or blacklisted, whatever it might be. And yet, how do we learn if we don't
Yes.
try? Because
Right.
how do we get those competencies and those being confident is by doing it and seeing how it
Yes.
feels, how the other person responds. Oh, that wasn't
Yes.
as terrible as I thought. I will
Yes.
do it again and do it again. And yeah,
Yes. And saying something that you think is fine, right? It doesn't occur to you. And then you say it, and either in the moment you say it, you hear it through their ears, or they say something to you. And then you think, okay, next time, don't say it that way. Next time, that's not the thing to ask or the thought to express. So you're right. You just learn by doing. And we are afraid of making mistakes. And I get that, of course. But I think when you make a mistake, if you own up to it in a workplace that is compassionate, that's not going to be a career ending mistake.
and if we think about who we want to be as professionals and we jump around, maybe we go from job to job. So maybe at this particular place, it doesn't seem all that compassionate. Okay, but who am I? Who do I want to
Yeah.
be? What is my reputation? And how am I going to show up? And how am I going to make space for other people to make mistakes?
Yeah.
And so it goes both ways, right? Extending that grace to others as we want them to extend that compassion to us.
Yes. And earlier you mentioned values. So values for the workplace as a whole, but our individual values. And I appreciate what you're saying. You might be in an environment that isn't going to change noticeably, but that doesn't mean you can't be compassionate. You can't recognize that other people might be struggling and find a way to be helpful.
And one more thing I want to add about compassion is sometimes people think compassionate is weak, that it's not following the rules, it's unjust because it's favoritism. And I really think the antidote to that is conversation. Let's talk
Mm-hmm.
about it in a team meeting. This person is out, they're on maybe compassionate leave or they're on they're out of the office, and we are flexible here, or we are compassionate, but we don't have to be in people's business. If you have
Yeah.
questions, ask them, or whatever it is, but continue to set, if you do have a flexible work schedule and somebody is using that, you don't, so it's that line of personal, but thinking about it and then acting, and constantly in your team saying, we're compassionate here. This is what it means. These are the rules that apply to everybody. And it also applies to you if you find yourself having an accident, or your parent dies or is in hospice. This applies to everyone, because here we care about everybody. And that's how we get great work done.
Yes. I think there's a fear if we let somebody take time off, personal time off for a difficult experience, that they're going to take advantage of the situation.
Mhm.
And then that person got something that I'm not going to get because I follow the rules and I would never do that. Well, are there people who take advantage of these kinds of things? Absolutely. But that's not a reason not to do them. The small number of people who might take advantage of something like this do not outweigh the benefits of having programs and policies and compassionate approach to the workplace.
Absolutely. And it's also an opportunity, if someone takes advantage of a situation, what to do next. Or
Yes,
am I being taken advantage of? We should all have mentors. Who can you talk to? Who can you troubleshoot with, so that you could find
yes,
the still compassionate next step? Because
yes,
sometimes compassionate is parting ways with somebody. That's the best for
yes,
everybody involved.
absolutely, absolutely. I think that's really important that you said that, because it isn't about how do we keep this person as an employee forever and ever now that they've dealt with this. Maybe the compassionate step at some point is that it's time for them to move on. But the point is that you've had those conversations with them about their role, about what's happening to them and what they need. So it's not a just suddenly you've decided you are not going to work for us anymore.
Yeah.
Because also, again, that has taken away that person's sense of control. So you're traumatized, you're out.
Yeah.
Then you've just added to their trauma and taken away their ability to control their professional life.
That's right. I absolutely agree. Sometimes the best thing for everyone involved is to part ways. That is the reality of it. But there are ways to do it with your humanity
Yes.
intact, and
Yes.
theirs as well. And that's from the very beginning, partnering with them, having these conversations. And even if it isn't something that's trauma related, but just some sort of performance related,
Yes. Yes.
continue to ask them questions. What would you do in this situation? How do you see this moving our organization forward, or whatever it might be? So that so many people are let go, and it's a shock. And that's what I deal a
Yes.
lot with, is if people who have been now they're traumatized because they were treated so awfully at work.
Yes.
And
Absolutely.
it doesn't go away just because you have a new job, right?
Yeah.
How we're treated by people has a way of resonating with us and
Yeah.
sticking with us unless we deal with it.
Yeah. And how would you trust the new environment that you went into, that they're not just going to decide, again, whatever the reason you were let go, is the next employer just going to decide that I'm not good enough and let me go without a conversation and without any opportunity for me to talk about what's going on and build that partnership?
Absolutely. So, Manya, I like to end on this last question. When you think about the future of work, what do you think needs to happen so that not only is everybody treated with dignity and respect, which is sort of a baseline, but that more than that, people are encouraged to thrive and flourish?
That is a great question. I think about the future of work and see these compassionate workplaces. I know that a stopping point for a lot of organizations, for whatever reason, is financial and the ability to measure the impact of I'm going to invest in this, and this is going to show up as a compassionate workforce that does this.
Mm.
I want the future of work to expand how we think about measuring the success of a company. So, financial, yes. I mean, that's why most organizations exist. That's important. But let's also find a way to layer in building a compassionate workforce. We're already talking about it in terms of environmental responsibility and ESG reports. So, that's what I want the future of work to, that there are compassionate measurements as well as financial measurements.
Hmm, that's a fantastic answer. Well, thank you so much for being on Conflict Managed. I so enjoyed our time together.
I did too. Thank you. This was a fabulous conversation.
Take care. Manya, what a joy it was talking with you today. I just love the work that you are interested in. Compassionate leadership, compassionate organizations. Don't we all want to work there? And so I suppose if we want to work there, then we've got to do the work of being compassionate. Conflict Managed is produced by third party workplace conflict restoration services and hosted by me, Mary Brown. You can find us online at 3pconflictrestoration.com. Come back, we have new episodes every Tuesday. If you haven't had a chance to check out my new book, it's How to Be Unprofessional at Work Tips to Ensure Failure. It looks at It looks at 80 things of what not to do and starts a conversation about what does it mean to be professional. Our music is courtesy of Dove Pilot. And remember, conflict is normal and expected. Let's deal with it. Until next time, take care.